What happens when a president's signature economic policy, a move designed to show strength and protect American industry, doesn't just fail, but backfires so badly that it ends up costing the U.S. Treasury $166 billion? Well, this isn't some hypothetical. It's the story of a high-stakes trade war, a dramatic Supreme Court showdown, and a massive financial mess that's still causing chaos in the global economy. It all kicked off with a series of aggressive tariffs meant to force America's closest trading partner, Canada, to bend the knee. Instead, it set off a chain reaction that led to a bombshell legal decision and a payout so huge it's hard to wrap your head around: $166 billion. That's money that was collected from businesses and now has to be paid back, with interest. In this video, we're going to break down exactly how this happened. We'll follow the trail from the initial power play to the courtroom drama, and finally, to the logistical nightmare of handing back more money than anyone has in modern history. This is the story of how a plan for American dominance spiraled into a colossal financial disaster. To really get how we got here, we have to rewind to early 2025. On February 1st, the Trump administration fired the first shot in what would become a punishing economic fight with its northern neighbor. The weapon they chose was a little-known but very powerful law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Now, IEEPA was passed way back in 1977. It was designed to give a president the power to regulate commerce during a national emergency in response to an unusual and extraordinary threat. Think sanctions on enemy nations or freezing terrorist assets. But the administration had a different idea. It declared a national emergency, not over a military threat, but over border security, specifically the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. Using that emergency as its justification, the White House slapped a sweeping 25% tariff on a huge range of Canadian goods. We're talking steel, aluminum, cars, and countless other products that are the lifeblood of the North American economy. This wasn't a targeted move, it was a sledgehammer. The official goal was to make Canada crack down on drug trafficking, but the sheer size of the tariffs sent a very different message. This was economic warfare. Right away, the excuse raised eyebrows. While the fentanyl crisis is a deadly serious issue, data showed Canada was a tiny source of fentanyl seized at the U.S. border. Critics, including many in Congress, argued the emergency was just a pretext, a way to use IEEPA as a personal tariff button and get around Congress, which is supposed to have the power to set taxes. President Trump's language at the time was tough. He sold the tariffs as a way to fix unfair trade deals. During his State of the Union address, he even claimed that because of his policies, prices are plummeting downward. That statement would later get completely blown up by the economic data, but it showed the administration's confidence. The message was simple: America wasn't going to be a pushover anymore. The immediate result was pure chaos for supply chains. For decades, industries like auto manufacturing had built their businesses on parts and goods flowing seamlessly across the border. A single car might cross back and forth multiple times as it's being built. All of a sudden, a 25% tax was thrown onto that process, wrecking decades of planning. American businesses, from tiny importers to huge corporations, were now stuck with a massive new cost they had no choice but to pay. It was a power play, all right, but the consequences were about to prove far more damaging to the United States than anyone seemed to realize. The American tariffs hit the Canadian economy like a body blow. After all, about 20% of the country's entire GDP comes from exports to the United States. But Ottawa didn't just sit there and take it. The response from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government was fast, smart, and unusually tough. Trudeau went public, calling the U.S. tariffs unacceptable and bogus, making it clear Canada wouldn't be pushed around. Instead of backing down, Canada readied its own volley of retaliatory tariffs. And this wasn't a panicked reaction. It was a calculated counterpunch designed to cause maximum political pain in the U.S. On March 4, 2025, Canada hit back with 25% tariffs on an initial $30 billion of U.S. exports. Just 3 weeks later, it escalated big time, adding another $125 billion in targeted goods. The grand total was staggering. $155 billion worth of American products were now facing heavy taxes to get into Canada. But the real genius of Canada's response wasn't just the amount, it was what they taxed. The list of targeted goods read like a political map of the U.S. It included iconic American products like Kentucky bourbon, appliances from the Midwest, and sports equipment, all specifically chosen because they were made in key Republican red states. The goal was to inflict direct economic pain on President Trump's political allies, turning his own supporters into a lobby against his policy. Prime Minister Trudeau's rhetoric got much sharper, too. He warned that the American tariffs would backfire, predicting they would lead to the shutting down of American auto assembly plants because of the broken supply chain. He even made the stunning accusation that Trump's ultimate goal was the total collapse of the Canadian economy, maybe as a step towards annexation. While that might have sounded extreme, it worked to rally the Canadian people, turning the trade dispute into a fight for their country's sovereignty. Canada's strategy was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. It knew that even though its economy was smaller, it still had leverage. By targeting politically sensitive states and industries, Canada made sure the pain of the trade war wasn't just some abstract idea in Washington, D.C. It was felt in the towns and factories of the administration's own base. The David and Goliath story was set, and the battle was about to move from the factory floor to the highest court in the land. While the tariff war was raging between the two countries, a quieter battle was being fought in U.S. courtrooms. American importers, the companies actually paying these billions in new taxes, weren't just taking it. From small family businesses to retail giants, they started suing, arguing that the president had no legal right to just invent taxes. They claimed that the IEEPA law, even with its emergency powers, never gave the president the authority to levy tariffs, a power the Constitution specifically gives to Congress. These lawsuits slowly made their way up through the federal court system. Lower courts actually sided with the importers, ruling that the tariffs were probably illegal. But those were just opening acts. Everyone knew the main event would be at the Supreme Court. The case that would decide it all was a consolidation of several lawsuits, known as Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump. The question for the 9 justices was simple but fundamental. Does the IEEPA law let the president just create tariffs on his own? The government's lawyers argued that the power to regulate importation was broad enough to include setting taxes. The importers' lawyers shot back that taxing and regulating are two totally different things, and Congress never meant to hand over its core power to tax. On February 20, 2026, the Supreme Court dropped its verdict. It was a bombshell. In a decisive 6-3 ruling, the court sided with the importers. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, declared that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. The ruling was a landmark decision on the separation of powers. It confirmed that while the president has a lot of power in foreign policy, the power of the purse, the ability to tax, still belongs to Congress. The ruling was a crushing blow to the administration's entire trade strategy. It didn't just cancel one tariff on one product, it blew up the entire legal foundation for the tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and other countries. The IEEPA tariffs were declared void, as if they never even existed in the first place. This had 2 huge consequences. First, the U.S. government was immediately stopped from collecting any more of these illegal taxes. But the second consequence was the one that would create a fiscal and logistical crisis. If the tariffs were illegal from the start, then all the money that had been collected had been taken unlawfully, and that meant the government had to give it all back. The Supreme Court's decision wasn't just a legal loss, it was the start of a financial earthquake. The question that shot through Washington and Wall Street was simple. Just how much money are we talking about? The answer was almost hard to believe. $166 billion. That colossal sum had been paid by over 330,000 different American importers on more than 53 million separate import entries. It was the price of doing business in a trade war, a tax on everything from Canadian steel used in American factories to essential manufacturing parts. Now, thanks to the Supreme Court, that $166 billion wasn't government revenue anymore. It was a debt owed to the very companies that had been forced to pay it. On March 4, 2026, just 2 weeks later, The U.S. Court of International Trade issued the formal order, pay the refunds. But that's a lot easier said than done. You can't just flip a switch and send out $166 billion. The agency in charge of this mess, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, was facing a logistical nightmare of its own making. CBP officials went straight back to the court with a serious warning. Their computer system, called ACE, was never built to handle refunds on this scale. They estimated it would take an unbelievable 4.4 million hours of manual labor to process all the claims. To avoid that, they needed time, at least 45 days, they pleaded, to build a whole new system from scratch. This new system was named CAPE, for Consolidated Administration and Processing of Entries. As of mid-March 2026, court documents showed CBP was scrambling to get it working, with different parts of the portal being anywhere from 40% to 80% complete. The plan was to create a website where importers could upload massive spreadsheets listing every single shipment they were owed a refund for. But even with a new portal, the process was a headache. CBP made it clear it wouldn't be proactively mailing out checks. The burden was on the importers. They had to track down every payment, submit a CAPE declaration, and get it all validated. The system then had to check every single one of those millions of entries against its own records, recalculate what the duty should have been, and then, to add insult to injury, calculate the interest owed on top of it. Because the money was taken unlawfully, the government had to pay interest, making the final bill even bigger. Meanwhile, Canada was watching this all very closely. Canadian officials started framing the issue in simple terms. Canada wanting $166 billion back. While technically the money was owed to the U.S. companies that paid, those costs had been passed all through the supply chain. Canadian exporters had to eat the costs or lower their prices to stay competitive. From Canada's point of view, this was their money, and they started working aggressively with U.S. brokers to make sure every last dollar was claimed. The Supreme Court ruling and the $166 billion refund it triggered represented a total collapse of the president's trade strategy. The tariffs, once sold as a brilliant negotiating tool and a huge source of revenue, were now a national embarrassment and a crippling financial problem. The administration had reportedly been counting on over $1 trillion in tariff revenue long-term, money that was supposed to help pay for major tax cuts. Now that future money was gone, and $166 billion of what they'd already collected had to be sent back. The policy had blown a massive hole in the nation's finances. The administration was backed into a corner. President Trump lashed out with a series of furious threats. He talked about imposing new, even crazier tariffs on Canada, threatening rates as high as 250% to 390% on dairy and lumber. He even threatened a 100% tariff on all imports if Canada deepened its trade with China. But these were empty threats. The Supreme Court had just taken his favorite toy away. The legal path he had used to create tariffs by himself, the IEEPA, was now closed for business. He had lost control. Facing a legal dead end, the administration had to make a desperate pivot. They needed a new weapon, a new legal justification to keep the pressure on. They found it in a different law, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Unlike the broad powers of IEEPA, Section 301 is more specific. It lets the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, investigate and respond to foreign trade practices that it considers unreasonable or discriminatory. It allows for tariffs, but usually after a long investigation. On March 11, 2026, less than a month after the Supreme Court defeat, the USTR announced it was starting a huge new wave of Section 301 investigations targeting dozens of countries for everything from manufacturing overcapacity to forced labor laws. This was the administration's Plan B, a way to try and put the tariffs back, one country at a time. But this is where the story gets really interesting. On the list of countries being targeted by these sweeping new investigations, there was one very obvious omission: Canada. The country that started the whole fight, the country at the center of the trade war, was specifically left out. This was no accident. It was a clear signal. By leaving Canada out, the Trump administration was quietly admitting defeat in their head-to-head fight. The narrative of the president losing control really came into focus here. He had been overruled by the courts. His threats were powerless, his signature policy had backfired, and now he was being forced to strategically ignore his main opponent. The tough talk was being replaced by a grudging reality. With a crucial 2026 review of the entire U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement coming up, the U.S. needed leverage, not an all-out war with its closest ally. The power dynamic had completely shifted. So, while Washington was busy trying to clean up its own mess, Ottawa was running a multi-front strategy that turned out to be incredibly successful. Canada's plan wasn't just about hitting back. It was a smart mix of legal action, targeted economic pain, and disciplined diplomacy. First and foremost was the legal strategy. Even though the lawsuits were filed by American companies, they were quietly backed by Canadian interests. Canada knew the best way to fight these tariffs wasn't through endless arguments, but by challenging their legality in the U.S. system. They supported the American importers who argued the president had overstepped his authority, a move that paid off with the landmark Supreme Court win. That $166 billion refund is the direct result of that foresight. The second part was targeted retaliation. As we talked about, Canada's counter-tariffs weren't a sledgehammer, they were a scalpel, aimed right at the administration's political pressure points. By taxing products from key Republican states, Canada turned the trade war into a domestic political problem for the White House. Suddenly, senators from places like Kentucky and Tennessee were getting angry phone calls from bourbon distillers and farmers who were being locked out of their biggest export market. The third pillar was firm diplomacy. Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet kept a unified front, consistently calling the U.S. tariffs illegal and bad for both countries. Trudeau's sharper rhetoric, accusing Trump of trying to collapse the Canadian economy, helped rally support at home and project an image of strength on the world stage. Behind the scenes, Canada also gently reminded Washington of its importance as a stable supplier of energy and critical minerals. Finally, Canada cleverly used the whole situation to its advantage. With the 2026 review of the USMCA trade deal on the horizon, Canada now walks into those negotiations from a position of incredible strength. The U.S., on the other hand, has been weakened by the court ruling and the fiscal crisis of the refunds. Canada's playbook was a masterclass in how a middle power can stand up to a superpower. It combined legal smarts, economic savvy, and diplomatic grit. The ultimate prize wasn't just getting the tariffs reversed. It was the $166 billion check that served as a very tangible symbol of its success. The economic damage from this year-long trade war was real, and it was felt on both sides of the border. It wasn't just about the billions of dollars refunded, it was about the real-world pain for businesses and families. For the United States, the wounds were self-inflicted. Beyond the headache of the $166 billion refund, the tariffs acted as a drag on the entire economy. Economic analyses estimated the policy slowed U.S. GDP growth. For regular people, the costs were passed on to them as consumers. Studies suggested that the trade war cost the average American household between $1,200 and $1,700 in the form of higher prices. President Trump's claim that prices were plummeting turned out to be the opposite of the truth. For Canada, the pain was even sharper. Its reliance on the U.S. market meant the tariffs sent a shockwave through its economy. Economists figure Canada's GDP took a hit of between 1.5% and 2%, a huge blow for a developed country. The pain was worst in industrial provinces like Ontario, where unemployment in manufacturing shot up. For the average Canadian family, the cost was estimated to be between $1,700 and $2,000. The trade war also changed the flow of business. For the first time in decades, thanks to tariffs on U.S.-built cars, Canada actually started importing more vehicles from Mexico than from the United States, a historic shift. Looking ahead, the U.S.-Canada trade relationship is forever changed. The upcoming review of the USMCA trade agreement on July 1, 2026, will be the first big test of this new reality. Canada is coming to the table with the legal and moral high ground, not to mention a $166 billion win. The United States is coming to the table with its main weapon broken and its credibility shot. This whole mess is a powerful cautionary tale about the real-world costs of protectionism and the limits of power. What started as a political power play ended in a legal and economic disaster, leaving behind a trail of financial damage and strained relationships that will take years to fix. So, what's the big takeaway from this wild chapter in North American history? We saw how a president's attempt to use economic force was checked by the power of the courts. We saw how a smart strategy by a smaller nation can counter the moves of a superpower. And we got a very stark $166 billion reminder that in our interconnected world, trade wars don't really have winners, just different degrees of losing. The story of the $166 billion payout is about more than just tariffs. It's about the rule of law, the complexity of supply chains, and the huge, often hidden costs of political gambles. The fallout is still being measured, and the process of refunding all that money is just getting started. But it leaves us with a huge question. Who should be held responsible for this massive and costly policy failure? Was it a flawed but necessary attempt to protect American interests, or was it a reckless gamble that blew up in everyone's faces? We want to know what you think. Head down to the comments and let us know. Who do you believe is responsible for the $166 billion mistake? And what lessons should our leaders learn from this? If you found this breakdown useful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into the events shaping our world. Thanks for watching.